We had Biden's visit to Kiev.
Oh
We
my
had
God. Well,
Wang Yi. We had Wang Yi go to Moscow. Now we have Janet Yellen in Kiev lecturing China. There's been a week-long lecture of China about
yes,
this
there
possibility
has.
of lethal aid. Ironically, 1-year anniversary since the, I guess you could say, open air hostilities of the proxy war. With direct Russian involvement, Russia's special military operation. But I remember last year, the United States was just willfully saying we're giving lethal aid to the United States is giving lethal aid to Ukraine's government in order to prepare for the Russian invasion, which ended up being a military operation to do what Russia was asked to do in 2014. What's your take on all? I don't know. I'll let you take it from there. What's all that's been going on worldwide?
They give us so much material, don't they? But yes, last week was the 24th was the first anniversary of what Russia calls its special military operation. And I want everybody to understand that this war, this is just the latest phase of a war that began in 2014 when the Obama administration backed a right-wing coup in Ukraine, which resulted in a civil war in Ukraine. The people of the Donbass region did not want to be part of the coup government. They have been under attack ever since. Some 14,000 people have died in that conflict. There was a means of ending this, the Minsk agreements, but which were signed by France and Germany were guarantors along with Ukraine, and the agreement was received unanimous approval in the UN Security Council in 2015, but Ukraine never acted on the provisions of the Minsk agreement. Now, the former leaders of Germany and France, Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, have said what you could have figured out for yourself, that it was always a sham. It was meant to help Ukraine arm. So there was never any serious work for peace. The U.S. was always using Ukraine to target Russia, whether it was for Ukraine to be in NATO or not. And also, they wanted to sever ties between Russia and Europe. Now, they succeeded in doing that, so that instead of having the natural gas from Russia, which made far more sense, that was a lot less expensive, now Germany is buying liquefied natural gas from the United States. What a surprise. And just in case they had any big ideas about being independent of the US, the United States blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. So at this point, militarily, anyone with any credibility is saying that Russia is winning. They have been all along. Ukraine has been aided by the US and Western European countries, so much so they're out of weapons. They're scrounging the world for weapons. The NATO nations don't have anything left to give. There's all this talk about tanks, which, you know, it's a months-long, sometimes years-long process to really learn to be an effective tank battalion. So it's a lot of nonsense. I'll make a long story short, a lot of war propaganda. So Biden goes to Kiev and their air raid sirens blaring.
Siren, that was such a joke.
And then they admit later in the day that Russia was well aware he was visiting and gave permission. So he had to ask Putin's permission.
So it was theater, and it was all theater. The siren was all just to create. I think Ukraine wanted to create some kind of scene and make it seem like there was danger while all the cameras were watching.
I think so too. And Biden wanted that also. So we have a new round of blue and yellow flags, and we'll stand by Ukraine. But to your point about China, China never said anything about arming Russia. So then the CIA guy goes on the Sunday talk shows and says, we have some confidence that we think China is considering giving weapons to Russia, which means it was all BS. But having said that, suppose they did. The U.S. feels like it can go halfway around the world and arm Ukraine. So what if they did? Even if it was true, and they bring up now all of a sudden it was pretty much dead in the news. COVID came from a lab. We don't know where COVID came from, but all of a sudden now that's in the news. And so it's beat up on China Week and Taiwan. And I say jokingly, although it's this very serious situation, they want to turn Taiwan into Ukraine and use it to get at China, but the results will be equally disastrous.
Yeah, if not more disastrous, given that with this, for me, I do not, regardless of whether there's some kind of halfway exit ramp or some kind of de-escalation of the conflict, whether that happens or not, and it's quite plausible that it would, given Russia's superior position. It is quite plausible that we'll see a significant shift on the battlefield. I don't think we're going to see the overall war end. So anything that happens with regard to Taiwan and China in the United States, I think, is quadrupling its troop presence in Taiwan. There's been, I don't know how many reports since the new year about how there's war preparations. There needs to be war preparations. You had Mike Minahan of the U.S. Air Force leak a memo saying 2025, let's get ready to shoot for the head, aim for the head against China. So you obviously have a pretty significant section of the neocon establishment, the foreign policy establishment, wanting a war with China. And that will also mean, if such a thing were to occur, that there would also be a war with Russia, because that's not going to end. I don't buy for 1 second that the United States can kind of walk away with its hands empty and say, okay, we lost in Ukraine, NATO lost in Ukraine, we're going to stop. No, because we know that this is part of a process. This is part of an overall agenda. It's part of a national security strategy. The aiming at the head is not just toward China, it's also toward Russia. So I think that's what makes it so dangerous, is it will never be just one or the other. It's always going to be both. And with that said, it's also true that that this agenda is just it's ongoing, and the hypocrisy is there, and you see the hypocrisy straight up with exactly what you said, Margaret. The fact that China cannot even think about it can't even it didn't even state that it was going to, and I think that this is just a way to once again demonize China, make China to look like the bad guy, the big bad bully in the world. Meanwhile, as this was happening, China was at the Munich Security Conference. It was giving its idea of what it would mean to have a just global order. They had a whole global security initiative that they rolled out there. And then they also rolled out a peace plan process. Now, it was really more of a position paper. It wasn't saying that, Russia and Ukraine have to do XYZ, NATO has to do XYZ, but it was pretty concrete in the sense of where China stood, and that peace in negotiations had to be a huge part of whatever future is going to transpire and develop within this conflict. So all of that is to say is that you're right. If China wanted to send arms to Russia, it's right, especially if Russia wanted arms and Russia said, give us military grade weaponry, give us arms. Will you do it? And China said yes. Well, that would be well within its right, just like it was well within Russia's right to intervene in Syria when the Syrian government said, hey, can you help us out? We have all these invading forces. We have a huge NATO-led coalition bombing our country. Could you help us out and help us with these ground forces that are leaking into the country, armed with U.S. and NATO and Israeli weaponry? Help us out. It's well within Russia's right, just like it would be well within China's right. But China didn't even have to say or do anything. Just like the balloon incident, a couple weeks before that, all of this, I think, is just to create this hysterical response in the U.S. and in NATO countries, the NATO sphere, as to what is the agenda, what is the target, and who is the target. And it's China. And I think sometimes it feels like when things are going bad in Ukraine, that's when you see this huge pivot, at least in the public relations and the propaganda and the media, toward China. And I think that's what's happening here. It's been happening for quite a bit now. It feels like all of February has been that process taking place.
Yeah, it has. It's like, all they have is things aren't going well when they ratchet up the war propaganda. And Blinken is going to Central Asian countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan and I think Uzbekistan, to tell them they should, not be aligned with Russia, which is right next door to them and with which they have very friendly relations. It would be funny if it were not so serious. But I noticed this weekend, people in Europe, there have been huge protests in London and Paris and in Berlin and in Italian cities. People are protesting against their governments, which have gone along with this mess, who have impoverished them, endangered their countries. Their leadership is not representative of them either. It's a interesting moment in history. All the countries that claim to be democracies are not, and show it in a variety of ways. We're supposed to hate China and Russia because they're authoritarian and dictatorships and so on and so on. But people in this country don't want I think it's now $113 billion to go to Ukraine, go to the military industrial complex mostly. And that's not something people here want. But there is none of the people who allegedly represent us will speak up on our behalf. I mean, to have no members a handful of Republicans, and I think it's funny, Republicans will allow some of their members some leeway for a short period of time. Democrats have total control and allow no one to deviate. But of all these congressional seats, how many is it? 435 in the country. There's not one district where most people want to say, hey, wait a minute, this isn't what I want. I find that very hard to believe. But that's what we were talking about in the previous conversation with O'Malley. These people are in crisis. They don't know what they should do. They don't have an out. So all they have is to do what they've been doing, even though it's not working for them. So that leaves the people of this country and people of the world in a predicament that we have these people controlling our lives who don't act in our interest, want us to shut up, and as they pursue ever more dangerous policies. So this blowing up of Nord Stream 2 and the silence from the media, silence from Congress, means that Biden can get away with doing something reckless and dangerous. And that, to me, is the most frightening thing right now.
Yeah, I mean, what the Biden administration has gotten away with, it's quite subtle. I think this is what, or at least it's quite subtle for those who aren't paying attention. I think what's been so just illuminating is how, we've had this process over the course of several administrations of this buildup towards shifting the strategy, the military strategy of the United States. And of course, right, it has dragged along its pack of dogs in Europe with it, and NATO. But we've had this ongoing, it's been more than a decade now, of shifting focus and attention. The US caused a lot of destruction all across the Middle East, the Arab world, the Muslim world. It caused, all kinds of destruction in Latin America. Of course, it played a huge role in the instability that O'Malley was talking about in Africa. And now it's looking at China and Russia as kind of, these are the next targets. This is how we maintain this unipolar hegemony, this superpower status. And Joe Biden's administration, it was campaigning back in 2020, you remember, as being the return to normal. But actually what Joe Biden's done is he's accelerated, I guess you could say, what is normal to these ruling elites, which is this constant warmongering and pushing and pushing and pushing to the more riskier and riskier conflict because, well, that's all there is. How else are people in Washington who are pulling the levers like Victoria Nuland, how else are they going to reproduce their careers? How else are these giant banks and corporations, how are they going to ensure that dollar dominance continues and that they continue to get huge returns on their literal parasitic arrangements all over the world? How are they going to do that? Well, they need to make sure that China and Russia do not become powerful enough to challenge that, because they already are. I mean, Omali brought up Africa. It's so important. All this last month, you have Emmanuel Macron, you have Antony Blinken. They're just lecturing, African countries over and over. And this has been all 2022 as well. You need to follow the sanctions. Why aren't you following the sanctions? If you don't follow the sanctions, there'll be consequences. Lecturing some of the poorest countries in the world with governments that had, many of these governments had been at least compliant in some respects. They wanted U.S. investment. They wanted Western investment. They didn't get any. All they got was disinvestment in looting and plundering. And so Russia comes along and says, hey, seems like you have an unstable political and military situation. We can help you with that. China comes along and says, hey, we have all of this telecommunications infrastructure. We can help build your electrical grids. We can help build roads and all of that. We can show you the way, and then, you can have it, and, hopefully it'll help you too. And then you can help us, because the African continent is one of the richest places in the world. So, I mean, we are at this just juncture of history of just complete and total and utter, both irrationality in the sense that everything that the United States does to maintain its superpower status backfires and blows right back at it and actually hurts its case. But also it's rational in the sense that this is how these people think. This is what they want. This is all that they feel like they can do to get what they want.
Yes, they don't know another way. And I mean, we've seen it unravel in the last year. Remember, they said they were going to turn the ruble to rubble because, all Russia has is gas and oil. And if they sanction that, that's going to be the end of Russia and it will collapse. Instead, we've seen more countries go into their sphere of influence. China and Russia are closer. And this was partly about China. They said, well, weaken Russia. China won't want to be their friend anymore. Although the two countries have to protect each other because they're both targets. So, of course, they've become closer. And no, they did not turn the ruble to rubble. Countries like India, they're buying Russian oil. Some of the European nations are buying Russian oil. They, will go from one ship to another ship, and they'll change a label, all kinds of things. But Russia is doing okay and weathered what could have been a terrible crisis. The U.S. has even ruined relationships with countries it was always friendly with. Saudi Arabia, they were trying to bully publicly. That's the other thing. These people are so amateurish, publicly bullying Saudi Arabia into pumping more oil, which of course would hurt Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis said, actually, no. So they welcome Xi Jinping, makes a state visit. It's a big deal. And that just shows you that they're flailing around. But you can't laugh at them because we know what they're capable of. And there are no nuclear treaties left. The U.S. has withdrawn or let expire all of these. So you have two major nuclear powers and no treaties currently, which is extremely dangerous. But they set us all up, or tried to set everybody up, with Russiagate. That was the purpose, was to give the U.S. a free hand and have people see, Russia as the evil place that you couldn't even talk to. And it's an unprovoked attack, unprovoked. And, it's like, no, it was provoked. And just in case people don't know what I'm talking about, they were instigating the Ukrainians to continue attacking Donbass and daring Russia not to help them. But even so, Russia was ready to talk. They were hoping to push Ukraine into talking to them. And they were talking, but the US and the UK scuttled those talks. So everybody who's died since that time, as far as I'm concerned, the blood is on US hands. Ukraine they are literally dragging men off the street, older
Disgusting.
men, teenage kids, dragging them off to the army, where they have a few weeks of training and then go to the front lines to get
It's
killed.
democracy. It's the democracy of Ukraine just working its magic.
And you know, so you have to look for the stuff yourself, of course, because the corporate media is no better at giving us information about this situation than they were a year ago. So I don't know what they're going to do. Are they going to abandon Ukraine after all of this? Are they going to do something crazy? Are they really going to try to fight two different superpowers at the same time? It's these are scary questions.